Okay, this is a brief review of for Biology A Unit 2 test. I'm just going to go very quickly through these, but if you learn these and you look at these slides, and there's a couple things that I'm going to have you look at on your own, you'll do great on that Unit 2 unit test. So I want you to know naturally occurring versus synthetic elements. Naturally occurring, as it sounds, would be ones that occur naturally in nature. Synthetic ones are artificially made. It could be in a particle accelerator. It could be using nuclear reactions. The general consensus is that there are 92 naturally occurring elements. Even though dependent on the definition of naturally occurring, some people believe there's only 88 up to a high of 94 by other people, but in general most people consider that there are 92 naturally occurring elements. Now we need to know what biochemistry is. Bio means life, so we can assume it has something to do with life or living things, and sure enough the chemistry part is dealing with the matter and energy. And so if you put them together, the biochemistry, we're dealing with matter and energy in living organisms. Some of the things that are covered in biochemistry you can see down below, and I'll let you read them. But there are things like, carbohydrates, fats, laws of thermodynamics such as energy can't be created or destroyed, proteins, enzymes, things like that. Now, they're going to want you to know what the most abundant element in the body is, and I've listed the 5 most abundant elements over to the right there. Now, if anybody was to ask you, what do you think is the most abundant element? I don't know if you would put oxygen, because I think most people think of oxygen being a gas. We breathe it into our lungs, but oxygen is actually the most abundant element in the body. And I think people kind of miss that one because they forget that oxygen is actually used to make up the molecule of water, H2O, and we know that our bodies are a huge percent of our body is water. So when you consider the water there, yes, now I can see that oxygen certainly could be the most abundant element, and it is. Now, if they asked you what the smallest unit of an element was, like maybe you took a chunk of gold and you cut it in half and cut it in half and cut it in half, what would be the very smallest piece of gold that you could obtain that still had all the properties of gold? And that would be 1 atom of gold. We have the nucleus there, we have the protons and neutrons in the nucleus, we have the electrons circling around it, but 1 atom of gold still has the properties of gold. So the smallest unit of an element would be 1 atom of that element. Now, what if we were dealing with the smallest unit of a compound? Now, a compound is made up of 2 or more different elements put together. They combine together. And so I thought a good example would be water. Now, water is made up of hydrogen and oxygen. You can see it down there at the bottom. I have a glass of water, and I also have to the right there 1 molecule of water. Now, if you had a glass of water and you kept taking a smaller and smaller and smaller part of it, what is the smallest piece that you can take that still would have all the properties of water and still be water? That would be 1 molecule of water. That would be 1 molecule H2O. Now, I couldn't say that just 1 atom of hydrogen would do it. I can't say that 1 atom of oxygen would do it, because it has to be the combination of the H2O together to actually make water. So I can't say that 1 atom of hydrogen would be the smallest piece. I can't say that 1 atom of oxygen would be, because then it wouldn't be water. So the smallest unit of a compound, such as water, would be 1 molecule of that particular compound. Now, we want to remember the parts of an atom. You probably have looked at these many times. In the nucleus, we have protons and neutrons. Protons having a positive charge, I remember because of the P. Neutrons sound like neutral to me, and neutrons have no charge. They're in the nucleus. And then we also have the electrons that circle around the outside of the nucleus. And electrons have a negative charge. So remember what the 3 parts of an atom are. And I've given you different artists draw them different ways, to represent what an atom looks like. And I've put three different ways here for you to actually see the three subatomic parts of an atom. Okay, so we need to know what atomic mass and atomic number are. We need to remember that, and I took one element off the periodic table over there to your left, carbon, and I see that the atomic number is 6, and you see it right above the letter C that represents carbon. Very important to remember that the atomic number, or which is the number of protons in one atom of that element, that's what makes it that element. If I had an element that did not have 6 protons in the nucleus, it could not be carbon. The only thing that makes one atom of carbon carbon is it has 6 protons in the nucleus. So very important to remember that. Now I'd like to have you try it here when I talk to you on the phone. When you call me and tell me that you've looked through this, I'm going to ask you, what are the atomic numbers for carbon, calcium, and nitrogen? Now if you look at the chart there, you can see that they don't write out carbon or calcium. You have to know what the chemical abbreviation for each of those elements is. And so carbon, I'll tell you, is C. Calcium, they just use the first two letters, Ca. And then nitrogen would be N. And you'll notice that if there are two letters, that it's the first letter that is capitalized and the second one is lowercase. So figure out what those are, and then when you talk to me on the phone, you can share with me what you came up with regarding the atomic numbers of those three elements. Okay, we want to know what the mass number, atomic mass, and the mass number are. Now, mass number is, remember, if we were to add, we take one atom of an element and we add the number of protons and neutrons, that would be the mass number. Now, what we're looking at here, though, I don't know if you've heard the term isotopes in your reading. Isotopes are different forms of the same element, and a good one is that hydrogen on the bottom over here on the left. You can see there that remember, to be hydrogen, even though there's three forms, remember the key is, are the number of protons the same in each one? Yes, they are. Each isotope of hydrogen has one proton. Now, what's different to actually make the forms different is, look at the little gray circles in each one. Those are the number of neutrons. You can see the first isotope of hydrogen there actually doesn't even have any neutrons. The one to the right there has 1, and the one at the bottom actually has 2. So what they do when you actually see the atomic mass, like on the periodic table, what they've done, sometimes you'll see that it's not a whole number, like it might be 12.16 or something like that. What they've done is they've taken all the isotopes of a particular element and they have averaged the mass numbers. Like for hydrogen there, we'd have to average the mass numbers for each of the three isotopes. If I looked up at the isotopes for oxygen, if we were to actually get the atomic mass, I would have to average the mass numbers from both of those isotopes. And you can see that in one of them, the number of neutrons is 8, and in the other one, there's 10. So both of those are still oxygen because the proton number is the same. But what's different in an isotope of an element is that the number of neutrons are different. So make sure that you know what the atomic mass is. And the atomic mass is actually figured by averaging the mass numbers of the isotopes for that particular element. Move on here. Ions, I want you to know, ions are when you have, it's an atom that has either lost or gained electrons. And what I've done here at the top, you can see that I have sodium, and I have it on the left there, sodium, and I can see the electron that's going around the nucleus, and it looks like it's shooting off. And so when you follow the arrow over to the right, it's probably some ionic bonding is going to go on. So that atom on the left has lost one electron. And over at the right there on the top, I showed you what that ion looks like. Now, we need to be able to determine though whether an ion is positive or negative. Positive ions are called cations, and the way I could remember that that's positive is that I see that third letter in cations, the T. It reminds me that those are positive ions. So the anions must be the negative because there's only two types. So when you have an atom and it's neutral, the number of protons or plus charges in the middle of the nucleus will always equal the number of electrons or negative charges outside the nucleus. So if you have an equal number of positive charges and negative charges, they kind of cancel each other out and you end up with an atom that's just neutral. But what happens, like on that sodium, when one electron is actually removed? Well, then what are we going to have more of with that particular atom? We now have lost an electron, we've lost a negative charge, so now I have more positive charges because the number of positive charges in the nucleus did not change. So for a sodium ion that has lost an electron, we call it a cation. It has a positive charge. And I've given you some other examples down below there. Let's see. Now you can tell sodium and chlorine, actually a sodium atom can bind with a chlorine atom, and I think this is a pretty good picture of it. One of those electrons in the bottom square there is actually going to come off, and it's actually going to go on, attach onto the chlorine atom. Now what does that make the sodium atom then? If I lost an electron, now I have more positive charges in the nucleus, so that sodium ion would have a plus charge. Now what happened to the chlorine atom over there? It gained an electron, so that means it gained an extra negative charge. So now there are more negative charges on the chlorine atom because they gained an electron. So there's more electric charge, more negative charges there. So now that atom is now become an ion, and it would have a negative charge because it has gotten an extra electron or negative charge to itself. So I hope that makes sense. If it doesn't, we can certainly go into it a little bit more detail, but if you look at the pictures and you think about what is happening there, and you remember that an atom to begin with is neutral, which means that the number of protons inside the nucleus is the same as the number of electrons outside. So the number of positive charges are the same as the number of negative charges, so we're neutral. But if an atom gains an electron, now it has one more negative charge than it does a positive. Overall, it's negative now. And if a atom loses an electron, now we could say, it has more protons in the nucleus, or positive charges now, so we would consider that particular ion now to be positive. So just take some time to look through that and kind of read through it slowly, look at the pictures, figure it out. They're going to want you to know what the octet rule is, and the octet rule usually deals with elements that have lower atomic numbers. Remember, the first shell around the nucleus can have a max of 2 electrons, and the second one can have a max of 8. And the octet rule says that atoms tend to gain, lose, or share one or more of their valence electrons. And do you remember what the valence electrons are? Those are the electrons that are in the outermost shell. So the octet rule tells me that atoms tend to gain, get one, lose, or even share one or more of their valence electrons so that they can get 8 in their outer shell, because we consider that a full outer shell. That is called the octet. And oct usually means 8, so the octet rule has something to do with 8. And I've put an example there of carbon. Carbon's in the middle. We're making CO2 a gas. Carbon has 4 electrons in its valence outer shell, valence electrons, and oxygen has 6. So neither one of them have that great 8 that we're looking for, that the octet rule, and there are certainly contradictions to this. It doesn't take place every time, but it's kind of a general rule. And this is a pretty good example of something that actually fits into that general rule. So what happens if we take that carbon in the middle and we put an oxygen atom on one side and an oxygen atom on the other, and they share? Now, sharing, I can count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 for that oxygen atom on the left. If I count the number of electrons that carbon has in the middle, I can see 4, 8. And if I count the number of electrons that the oxygen atom on the right has, I see 8. So by sharing, each of those atoms actually has 8, which is what we're looking for. So that's what the octet rule states. Valence electrons are, remember, in the outer shell, the number of electrons that are in that outer shell we consider to be the valence electrons. And it's kind of neat. Not all periodic tables, but some will tell you, like see that oxygen over to the left? You see that there are 8 that the atomic number is 8, so there's 8 protons. And in a neutral atom of oxygen, that would mean that there also would have to be 8 electrons. Well, look at that 2 and that 6. I love it when they break it down like this. Not all tables do, like I said. But that tells me that the first shell around the nucleus has 2 electrons and the second one has 6. So in this case, that there are 6 in the outermost shell, and so oxygen has 6 valence electrons. We need to know briefly, just very briefly, the type of reactions there are, and I wrote them down here: reversible, synthesis, decomposition, and an exchange. And if you look at the examples that I gave, you can almost figure out by looking at the word itself what is happening. If something's reversible, do you see that yellow arrow there in the middle, that where it says ADP plus P plus E, and then that yellow arrow that's pointing both ways, and then ATP on the right? That tells me, and I don't know if you remember what that ADP, it's adenosine diphosphate. And if I add another phosphorus to it, I actually get ATP, which is triphosphate. But that ATP can also go left and break back down into ADP plus P, and the E is energy. So if you see that yellow arrow going back and forth, that shows that the reaction is actually taking place both ways. I have something being formed, but then I actually have what's formed is actually breaking back down into something else. So that reversible, that makes sense. Synthesis, if you synthesize something, aren't you making something new? So that would be sodium Na plus chlorine Cl. And sure enough, chlorine's a gas. Sodium is a very volatile material that you actually have to keep in oil. If I put it in, take it out of oil and I leave it in oxygen, it bursts into flames. But if I put them together and I synthesize something new, NaCl is table salt. So that's kind of interesting. So synthesizing something new. Decomposition, if something decomposes, we say it breaks down. Certainly, I have HGO, and I can see that it's breaking down into just the Hg and the O. So it's actually breaking down something. And to exchange, well, exchange would mean I must be taking something on one and exchanging it from somebody else for a different thing. And look at that one, HCl plus NaOH. Instead of when I follow the arrow to the right, the Na is now with the Cl, and the H is with the oxygen. So we've had an exchange take place here. So look carefully at those, make sure that they fit exactly, I think, what the words themselves seem to indicate when you say reversible or synthesis or decomposition or exchange. So just kind of look through them and figure it out. Just don't read it, but see if you can actually see why as you look at the examples I've given you here. What needs to be done to start a chemical reaction? I'd like to have you read through this. It takes a little bit too long for me to do it. Usually you have to have, and I think this explains it just beautifully, and you're going to have a question on that, at least one on your test. So read through that. If you don't understand it, we can get together and look through it together. But I think it does a really fine job on telling you what needs to be done to actually start a chemical reaction. The law of mass action, and I have a picture here. Do you see that we have these little molecules, the little red dots there? And the other, where it says binding site, evidently we have some reaction that's going to take place, and those little red dots have to come down and bind at that binding site. And you can see there's not a lot of them there, and so if the concentration is very low, the reaction doesn't take place as fast because it takes longer for one to get over there and get in just the right position to pop into that binding site to actually then cause something to happen. But look on the right side. I have a lot of those molecules there, much greater chance of one coming over and plopping in that binding site. So the law of mass action tells me that the higher the concentration of molecules, the faster the reaction can occur, because the probability is certainly much greater that something's going to happen. So you need to know that. Here's some additional question topics that you will see on your test. I just wrote them down here. Know what carbohydrates, lipids, all that is. Take down and look at some of the questions here. I gave you some ideas as to the type of question that they would ask dealing with those words that I listed at the top. And last but not least, the pH scale. Do you remember that pH? And it's a lowercase p, capital H, is a scale that measures how acidic or basic that something is. And if we think of something like a lemon, we know it's very acidic. If we think of something like maybe milk and magnesia, we know it's more basic. And so the pH is a scale of 0 to 14. And the closer you get to 0, the stronger the acid content is. 7 is neutral. It's neither really considered acidic nor is it considered basic. Now when I start going the other way from 7, like 8, 9, 10, the further I get away from that 7, the more and more basic it becomes. Whatever that particular item is that we're talking about, whether it's ammonia or battery acid or milk, whatever it is. So you can tell that in the middle is 7 neutral. If I get further away from it towards 0, the further I get away, the stronger the acid is. If I go the other way, away from 7 being neutral, the further I get away from it, the stronger that base is. And they'll want you to know too that acids usually release hydrogen ions. That's all you kind of need to know right now. And base, which is a H plus, and bases, when they're in water, they release OH ions. So the more OH ions or the more H plus ions there are, the stronger base or acid it is. And they also want you to know too that living things usually need a pH. We don't want to be too far, in the acid range, and we don't want to be too far in the base range. Living things usually need a pH between 5 and 8. So give me a call after watching this. I hope that's a great study guide for you if you go through it and really concentrate on what you're looking at here and figuring it out, answering those other questions. You will get most likely an A on the exam. Let me know if there's any other way that I can help you. And remember to give me a call, okay, so that I can give you credit for having looked at this and then tell me what the atomic numbers of those 3 elements are. Thanks. Bye.